A. Alphabet. The Odyssey and the Iliad are among the earliest known works written in the Greek alphabet, which developed sometime around the 8th century BCE from contact with the Phoenician abjad, but it has been suggested, first in the 1950s by Theodore Wade Gary, more recently by Barry Powell, that this is no coincidence. The alphabet may have been directly created to take down Homer's epics, its system of vowels tuned finely for the poem's complex meters. Subsequently, though, the publication of archaeological finds from the start of the 8th century BCE boasting basic written Greek, that is, before even the earliest of proposed dates for the epic's recording accepted by mainstream scholarship, has rendered this theory obsolete. B. Bicameralism. Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus and Telemachus are led and commanded by Athena. Throughout the Iliad, heroes' emotional responses are figured as directed by the gods. The first real divine interjection is Athena appearing to restrain Achilles from striking his general Agamemnon. Furthermore, in introducing these stories, the poet styles their recital as the words of the muse. Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, as Robert Fagles opens his Odyssey. The lives, and particularly the mental lives, of Homer's humans then are closely tied to the divine, and in the 1970s, this aspect of Homer's poems was pressed into the service of a radical new theory of psychology. In his book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, American writer Julian Jaynes proposed that the split between the brain's left and right hemispheres was, until around 3,000 years ago, far more pronounced, that early humanity lacked the cognitive ability to mediate between the brain's two chambers, and accordingly lacked consciousness as we understand it, perceiving emotions, thoughts, instructions from one side as the voice of a god. The characters of the Iliad, Jaynes claims, do not sit down and think out what they do. They have no conscious minds, such as we say we have, and certainly no introspections. The gods take the place of consciousness. As such, this reading suggests we ought to view the poem not as some nostalgic reconstruction of its culture's half-remembered glory days, where men and women were simpler, stronger, nearer to the gods, but as straightforwardly documenting a lived reality of split minds and hallucinated deities. It is similar in the Odyssey, his book goes on to claim, but in the latter poem, there are signs of the bicameral mind's breakdown, and therefore the first stirrings of human, or at least European, consciousness. Jaynes' ideas have failed to find much traction in the scientific world, but we won't evaluate the thesis itself here. Regrettably, the development of human consciousness is outside the scope of this video. We can observe, though, that Jaynes' load-bearing Homeric readings all kind of suck. Again, Jaynes' core contention about the Iliad is that it does not depict individuals with conscious, introspecting minds, but it's a position he's only able to maintain by pointing out all the times the poem does depict these things and claiming they're all later insertions. C.O. And his attempt to explain away the Odyssey's numerous counterexamples by placing it as a cutting-edge example of the next stage of Greek consciousness can only work with his rather unorthodox dating of the poem as at least a century or more after the Iliad. Mainstream opinion places the Odyssey perhaps a generation after its predecessor. Yes, when it comes to the Odyssey's focus on things like interiority and uncertainty and trickery, the contrast with the Iliad is astonishing, as Jaynes rightfully observes. But this can't simply be because it's a story about different things. No, it's because the ancient Greeks all did a 2001 with their brains in the gap between one poem and the next. Jaynes' attempt to ground his theory in Homer also disregards most other sorts of god-human interactions beside God directs human to do X thing, of which there are many. Throughout the Odyssey, Athena regularly transforms Odysseus' appearance. In the Iliad, gods airlift their favorite heroes out of battle. Thinking about Book 13 of the Odyssey, it would surely be hard to interpret Zeus and Poseidon's punishment of the Phaeacians, slamming a mountain down on top of their prize boat and sealing their harbour, CZ, as a primitive culture's attempt to express brain no worky. Jane's examples do prove to highlight the fact that the Homeric poems represent mental processes in ways that differ from the way we tend to now, something never really in question, but to assume that representation was necessarily an authentic, automatic transmission of the way its tellers understood the world does a tremendous disservice to those tellers and their work. Think about it this way. If all that remained of our current civilization were a DVD of 2007's Ratatouille, the anthropologists of the future would hardly be justified in concluding 21st century man believed rodent spirits controlled human agency. Don't ask why I'm wearing a hat in this video though. All this to say, bicameral consciousness as a psychological project may not be entirely obsolete. Psychologists let us know in the comments. But as a reading of a text like the Odyssey, it rightfully is. I'm wearing a hat, by the way, because my hair's too long. Looks kind of bad. I'm going to put it back on. C. Chapman's Homer. George Chapman was a poet and playwright of the English Renaissance, well known today for completing the first English translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad in the early 17th century. Today, the impact this translation had on the Homeric tradition, and indeed English poetry itself, is readily visible. It even influenced Shakespeare. Chapman's Homer casts a long shadow. Or at least it used to. In classicist Jan Parker's opinion, the qualities most important to Chapman's translation are excitement and vitality. And while these are undoubtedly still present, they kind of get harder to access with each passing year. Compare a couplet in Chapman I selected at random with Robert Fagel's more modern rendering. But he himself solemnized their retreat, to the Ethiops far dissundered in their seat. But now Poseidon had gone to visit the Ethiopians worlds away, Ethiopians off at the farthest limits of mankind. Everyone has their own preferred translations, of course, and even less popular versions are never truly dead, never truly obsolete. No piece of art, no idea ever really is. But it's hard not to see why the sway Chapman's verse once held over the way we understood and imagined the Odyssey has diminished over the centuries. As with any form of adaptation, translation is a fixing of the work in a new medium, here the English language, but also in a specific time. 200 years afterwards, Samuel Taylor Coleridge observed that Chapman gave us Homer as he might have written had he lived in England in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Modern translator Emily Wilson expands on the thought. Chapman's Odyssey presents the hero as a true soldier and gentleman, a proto-Christian and proto-Stoic whose greatest virtue is his ability to endure suffering and control his impulses. Truly neutral translations are impossible, of course, but most readers today prefer to read an Odyssey mediated through their culture rather than that of Renaissance England. Even those interested in more archaic translations tend to look first to Chapman's eventual successor, Alexander Pope, CP. These days, then, Chapman's Homer is admired more than it is read, and those who do read it tend to be more interested in late Tudor poetics than in suitors, sirens, and wine-dark seas. But it hasn't disappeared. It's just gradually receded. And even now, silted up by the long centuries, it still has the power to move, to strike the careful reader silent as Cortez upon his peak in Darien. D. Denmark. Famously, the Odyssey is a poem about a journey around the Mediterranean that corresponds very poorly to the region's actual geography. A couple of examples among a great many. Homer's Ithaca is the westernmost island in its archipelago. Ours lies immediately east of Kefalonia. The island of Pharos, in reality 1 mile offshore, requires a full day's sail from Egypt in the Odyssey. Again, this section could be quite long. The poem's oniric topography was a problem that vexed even ancient commentators. In the words of famed Alexandrian geographer Eratosthenes, you will find the scene of the wanderings of Odysseus when you find the cobbler who sewed up the bag of winds. To amateur historian Felice Vince, though, the problem at the heart of thousands of years' worth of geographical headaches was obvious. They were all looking in the wrong sea. In 2006, Vince published his book, The Baltic Origins of Homer's Epic Tales, a sustained argument for transposing the Odyssey setting north over 1,000 miles. Troy, the start of Odysseus' Odyssey, is placed in Finland, along with Olympus. Since Plutarch, writing nearly a millennium after the Odyssey came together, claimed Calypso's island of Ogygia lay 5 days west of Britain, Vinci identifies it with the Faroe Islands, which are north of Britain. And Ithaca, Odysseus' home, becomes the island of Lu in Denmark, because Danann, one of Homer's terms for his Greeks, sounds like Dane. For all the obvious reasons, Vinci's hypothesis currently enjoys little support, but for the avoidance of doubt, here are the best 2 cases against Vinci's idea, and for that matter, the family of similar theories that have attempted to plot Odysseus' voyage in other far-flung locales. First, Homer was a poet, not a geographer. True, some of Homer's geography is startlingly precise, as with the layout of the Iliad's Troad, but as should be obvious, spatial exactitude across a few square miles of Anatolian land is a significantly lower bar than accurate depiction of an entire sea. Even if a Homer CH had travelled the length and breadth of the Mediterranean in an era when no Greek had, the expected margin of error grows 1,000-fold. In other words, even leaving aside inconvenient facts like shifting coastlines and rising seas, the fact that an explanation like Vinci's supposedly fits exactly is its own counter-argument. It'd be sort of like seeing a mole of yours in an inkblot card and working out from this that the Rorschach test had secretly been invented by your dermatologist, presumably alongside a time machine. Second, Homer was a poet, not a geographer. That is, there are all sorts of writerly explanations for Odysseus' sea differing from Homer's own. For instance, Bernard Knox points out that many of the poem's maritime escapades are clearly riffing on the already well-known story of Jason and the Argonauts. What Homer has done is to transfer episodes from a mythical epic journey in eastern waters to western seas, Knox writes. No wonder the geography gets a little wobbly. E. Epithets. Throughout the Odyssey, and indeed the Iliad, characters, places, and things are very often described in repetitious ways. Odysseus is godlike, much enduring again and again. Ithaca is always rocky, sea-girt, not merely on their introduction, but the 10th, the 100th time, too. Anyone looking into the Homeric poems will quickly notice the omnipresence of these epithets, but for a long time, their presence perplexed readers. In 1872, though, German scholar Heinrich Dunzer made a discovery. The many ways Homer describes a given object tend to vary in meter. The purpose of a Homeric epithet, then, is primarily structural. If Odysseus is to be mentioned near the end of a line of the poem's dactylic hexameter, the ancient Greek phrase Robert Fagles translates as much enduring, brilliant Odysseus allows the line to conclude in a technically correct way. These insights were advanced by a line of scholars in Dunzer's wake, none more so than the renowned Milman Parry, C.I., whose studies demonstrated that this diverse library of epithets was the fruit of a sophisticated oral culture. Generations of improvising poets had naturally built up a vast reserve of stock words and phrases to be recombined in familiar ways according to the demands of the context. Disagreement continued and continues over whether there is any one Homer to speak of and to what degree the texts we have were improvised, ch. But by following the trail of the epithets, Parry proved that at an absolute minimum, any Homer drew heavily on generations of poetic forebears. But the trail may have been taken too far. Convinced yet more of the poetry's features were formulaic, Parry and his followers began pursuing spurious arguments. Perhaps syntactically similar lines with only one repeated word should be lumped in with exact repetitions and stock epithets, some thought. Perhaps even syntactically similar lines with no repeated words should be viewed in this way. At its height, this line of thinking reached a sort of metrical determinism. By one such method of counting, up to 90% of Homer's verse was made up of inherited formulas. But, in the words of Bernard Knox, the argument for full formularity has feet of clay. As Knox explains, a poet composing in a strict, demanding meter is bound to repeat syntactical combinations in identical positions, and the stricter the meter, the higher the incidence of such repeated patterns. Moreover, Sheila Moynihan notes that many Homeric lines that at first appear to be formulaic diverge from their formulas in unexpected ways. There is a deft balance between repetition and subversion observable throughout. We should think of Homer as indebted to his traditional epithets and related formulas then, but we should never think of him as beholden to them. F. Fantasy. Since the composition of the Homeric poems, readerly consensus on how far, if at all, they can be described as historical has varied. Generally speaking, the ancients had a sense that fact mixed with fiction in Homer's verse, but by the time the poems trickled through into the language and thought of post-Renaissance Europe, those ancients were seen as overly credulous fools, and the poems as pure fantasy. Writing in the 17th century and expressing the general sentiment of the time, Blaise Pascal proclaims, "Nobody thought that Troy and Agamemnon existed any more than the Golden Apple did." Pascal was really into Minecraft. But a few decades later, at the beginning of the 18th century, the ruins of Mycenae were found. Then, during the 19th century, so was Troy. CS. As our historical picture of the Bronze Age has developed, it has emerged that various Eastern Mediterranean cities and civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks, including Troy, suffered a precipitous decline. We call this the Bronze Age collapse, and its timing lines up startlingly well with the date ancient scholars like Eratosthenes gave for the mythical fall of Troy. More recent archaeology has uncovered fascinating indications that the Mycenaean Greeks did engage the Hittites, that is, the historical overlords of Bronze Age Troy, in military conflicts in the preceding years. We've also learned that a number of the migrants/pirates that ran rampant in the eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age collapse, the so-called Sea Peoples, were displaced Mycenaean Greeks, driven to foreign shores by a variety of factors, possibly including climate change, natural disasters, and civil unrest. The parallel between this fact and the Odyssey's depiction of the wayward Greek veterans, Odysseus, Menelaus, Agamemnon, sometimes returning home laden with booty, sometimes ending up in other countries altogether, sometimes meeting a grisly end back at home, speaks for itself. And fast-forwarding to the social changes happening in Homer's time, many have read scenes like Odysseus's very colonial appraisal of the Cyclopes island as a straightforward reflection of the boom in overseas Greek expansion the 8th century BCE was seeing. We mustn't go too far, in the way that those complaining about anachronism in illustrations or adaptations of Homer do. No, it wouldn't be more historically correct to draw inspiration from Bronze Age Greek armor, because the Odyssey never happened. It's the equivalent of criticizing Game of Thrones because the real Wars of the Roses didn't involve dragons. There may have been Trojan-Mycenaean conflicts during the Bronze Age, but these were not Homer's Trojan War. There may have been Mycenaean Greeks displaced during the Bronze Age collapse, but their journeys were not those of Homer's wayward heroes. But equally, we would be wrong to treat the Odyssey as pure fantasy. Real places intermingle with those imagined. Real historical patterns and cycles seem to lie beneath the roots of Homer's fiction, bonded together so closely and for so long as to continually defy our efforts at extricating them. G. Good dog. Now, as they talked on, a dog that lay there lifted up his muzzle, pricked his ears. It was Argos, long-enduring Odysseus's dog he trained as a puppy once, but little joy he got, since all too soon he shipped to sacred Troy. Infested with ticks, half dead from neglect, here lay the hound, old Argos. But the moment he sensed Odysseus standing by, he thumped his tail, nuzzling low, and his ears dropped, though he had no strength to drag himself an inch toward his master. Odysseus glanced to the side and flicked away a tear. This passage of Book 17, detailing Odysseus' reunion with his old dog, Argos, has often been taken as the oldest extant depiction of an extremely good dog. But, excavating a tomb in 1935, Egyptologist George Reisner discovered a tablet bearing the following inscription. The dog which was the guard of his majesty, Abutiyu is his name. His majesty ordered that he be buried ceremonially, that he be given a coffin from the royal treasury, fine linen in great quantity, and incense. His majesty also gave perfumed ointment, and ordered that a tomb be built for him by the gangs of masons. His majesty did this for him in order that he, the dog, might be honored. Abutiyu's master was an unknown pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, sometime between the 24th and 21st centuries BCE. H. Homer. Who is responsible for the composition of the Odyssey? Homer, right? This was the traditional view. The ancients tended to believe that the Iliad and probably the Odyssey too were composed and probably written by Homer, a blind bard from Chios, at some point in the first half of the first millennium BCE. Even then, though, there were disagreements. One group, known as the Separatists, held that the Iliad had been written by Homer, but that the Odyssey was the work of a different, later poet. And one ancient writer, Josephus, argued that there had been a Homer, but he had transmitted a number of shorter poems orally. These were only combined generations later. Nowadays, it's generally accepted that this latter position was nearest the mark. From the 1700s or so onwards, scholars have argued in two main camps over the so-called Homeric question. Unitarians argue that the poems are in the main the result of one mind, Homer, if you will, even though we have no reason bar tradition to assign that name or blindness to the poet, and analysts argue the contrary, that the Iliad and the Odyssey was stitched together gradually by many hands from traditional or generic material that had passed through generations of Greek storytellers, very possibly, as Josephus had believed, in the form of those shorter poems, or lays, CL. The case against individual genius was strengthened by the findings of Milman Parry in the early 20th century, CE and I, to the point that no modern reader can reasonably believe either or both poems to be wholly front to back the original inventions of one single poet, but even today scholars find themselves in disagreement. Robin Lane Fox's recent book, Homer and His Iliad, makes a modernized Unitarian argument for one master poet using a rich, inherited body of narrative, poetic, and lexical matter to plot, perform, and somehow record an Iliad very similar to our own, only lightly altered in the following centuries, with eloquence. Jeffrey Kirke believed that against the backdrop of broadly similar stories, the standout work of one monumental composer gained enough popularity and acclaim to become standard, but was passed down through a few subsequent generations of oral poets before being committed to writing. Either way, the notion of one Homer writing or even composing all the words our book's spines attribute to him is obsolete. It's still common to refer to Homer when discussing the poems, but this is understood to be for convenience's sake. After all, the Odyssey, by probably a bunch of guys, maybe even women too, CW, possibly just the cumulative work of an entire culture, doesn't really roll off the tongue. Illiterate. Homeric scholarship was revolutionized in the early 20th century when American classicist Milman Parry visited Yugoslavia to study the works and methods of the country's traditional Serbo-Croat oral poets. Parry, later accompanied by his assistant Albert Lord, who would go on to champion Parry's research after the former's early death, made many leaps forward in deciphering certain peculiarities of the Odyssey and the Iliad, CE, and ultimately redefined the terms of the Homeric debate. As Emily Wilson puts it, Lord and Parry proved definitively that the Homeric poems show the mark of oral composition. And one corollary of that proof seemed to be a demonstration that Homer, or any Homer-like figure responsible for the final version of any texts ultimately recorded, was illiterate. The singers Lord and Parry studied and recorded could not read or write, and after one such poet who had become literate and subsequently lost the ability to compose orally was found in Bosnia, it appeared and was generally accepted that whatever sophisticated mental architecture was needed to hold, reshape, and perform epic orally was somehow incompatible with literacy. More recent work in this field, though, has undermined this conclusion. Again, in Wilson's words, it has now been shown that oral traditions can interact with literacy in a number of ways, and they are not necessarily driven out as soon as literacy arrives. In Somalia, for example, oral poets have been able to continue their oral compositions even after acquiring literacy. Oral literature is more diverse than Parry, with a single point of cultural comparison, could discern. Similar examples of literate oral composers have also been found in Kyrgyzstan. This isn't to say that the case for an illiterate or partly literate Homer is dead. Many eminent scholars still think this may have been the case, just that there is no longer a reason to think he must have been. And that's not even mentioning all the times we've watched him fail to read things properly. J. Johnson's Starmap. In 1999, Lauren R. Johnson published Shining in the Ancient Sea, the astronomical ancestry of Homer's Odyssey, whose basic argument is, in Johnson's own words, that the Odyssey had its beginnings as a poem designed in a pre-literate society to pass on the knowledge of the heavens. More specifically, Johnson reads Odysseus's wayward journey as symbolizing a circular progression through 28 star groups, corresponding to the equivalents in the Hindu Vedas. To quote one writer's summary on Johnson's theory, the killing of a great stag in Odyssey Book 10, for example, corresponds to the destruction of the constellation of Orion as he disappears below the horizon. There is a mnemonic code of astronomical lore at the heart of the Odyssey, he suggests. And if all that sounds a little unclear, don't worry, Johnson included a diagram to clear it up. There you go, now you get it. John McMahon, in a contemporary book review for the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, did not mince his words. The work has numerous deficiencies that disqualify it as a serious academic contribution. These include a total ignorance of Homer's Greek, a lack of familiarity with relevant literature, and missing page numbers. Beyond this, one of the foundations of Johnson's reading is the argument for the survival of an Indo-European oral tradition of cosmology to Homer's day. If that sentence was meaningless to you, CT. In itself, this is a stretch, but surely the bigger pill to swallow is the idea of this system filtering through potentially generations worth of semi-improvised performances and emerging so intact as to permit decoding 3 millennia later. Similarly, celestial voyage stories had circulated in and around the Mediterranean for quite some time, so the idea that an ancient Near Eastern cosmology narrative or two might be present in the Odyssey's hodgepodge of mythic substrates is in itself plausible. Again, it's the double movement Johnson makes from conjecture to certainty, and then from that certainty to further elaborate constructions that overextends his argument. Laying out a perfect theory of everything atop a shaky premise doesn't make that premise any less shaky. And we don't need to concoct outlandish explanations to make sense of the poem's weird geography. The normal explanations do fine. C, D, and N. For these reasons and more, Johnson's reading of the Odyssey as a text secretly revolving around a very ancient, very intricate cosmological schema, a device preserving the astrological wisdom of a lost culture, has failed to catch on. It is, however, a beautiful idea. To quote the end of McMahon's review, unremittingly harsh before this point, one of the things that the work may accomplish is to prompt readers unfamiliar with the night sky to actually step outside and look up at the very heavens that had so much of an effect on the culture of the ancients. That alone might be enough to warrant an uncritical perusal. K. Kirke. Who is this character? What is her name? How is it said? Many now familiar Greek texts, including the Odyssey, first became known in England through medieval Latin translations. And when it comes to the text's names, this origin conferred a lasting prestige to many Latinate forms. To speak of Jupiter instead of Zeus is to sound fancier. But it's also to sound more old-fashioned. Many such forms have fallen out of style. There's a reason I'm referring to the poem's protagonist as Odysseus instead of Ulysses in this essay. Or that I'm doing so most of the time, at least. See you. In the early days of English translation, CC, poems went with Latinate names. In Chapman or Pope, you'll read about Neptune arguing with Minerva over the fate of Ulysses, and so on. More recently, though, there was something of a counter-movement. Per Bernard Knox, recent poet translators have tried to get closer to the original Greek and have transliterated the Greek names directly, not through the medium of their Latin adaptations. In many names, the difference is negligible. Few English readers would stumble upon encountering Euboea instead of Euboea, for instance. But certain names become a little more unfamiliar. Probably the highest profile Odyssey following this trend was Robert Fitzgerald's. For the first few books, we follow Telemachus. Eventually, we meet Kirke, not Circe. His Iliad doesn't follow Achilles, but Achilleus, and so on. In a sense, though, this archaizing is misleading. It suggests greater authenticity, but wrongly, I think. These names are transliterated from Greek, but they are still transliterated. They sit among the countless thousands of non-Greek derived words that make up a translation. Yes, Fitzgerald's names sound more like they would have done to Homer's early audiences, but his poetry is unrhymed, his meter irregular. Is his poetry's sound authentic when compared to Chapman and Pope's rhyming couplets to Wilson's blank verse, then? And even if so, is it worth the disorientation this choice may produce? The equilibrium most modern translators have landed on is Greek names transliterated on Latin principles. So Athena, not Minerva. There's a general sense that this is the more natural way to do it, probably because English as a language owes far more to Latin than Greek. In any case, attempting to reach some true original Homer through translation has always been something of a losing game. See C and O. Indeed, some later editions of Fitzgerald's translations even concede this point and return to the Latinate mean. So long, Kirke. L. Lays. The argument viewing the Homeric poems as a tapestry of shorter songs, or lays, only unified well after having become known individually, is a rather old one, ch. Josephus was the outspoken proponent of this theory in ancient times. In modernity, an early supporter was Neapolitan philosopher Giambattista Vico, who claimed that ultimately, Homer was nothing more than an aggregate of the ancient Greek people. He was followed in 1795 by the early German philologist Friedrich Wolff, who laid out a more systematized version of this thought, that Homer had composed lays around 900 BCE, that these were passed down and added to by centuries worth of followers, and that these were only stitched together in 6th century BCE Athens. Various enthusiastic attempts to pull the poems apart, to trace the seams marking the points at which these lays were stitched together, followed. And I say attempts followed, plural, because as Bernard Knox puts it, of course, no two scholars could agree about how to take the poems apart. Because many of the seemingly obvious candidates fall short upon closer inspection. One of Knox's examples here is the so-called Telemachia, those 4 books opening the Odyssey which follow not Odysseus, but his son Telemachus, that is, his first son, CQ. Commentators have noted the peculiarity of this structuring for literally thousands of years, so yeah, originally independent lay identified, right? Well, no, not really. In Knox's words, the story of Telemachus is no fit subject for heroic song. There is nothing heroic about it until Telemachus takes his place, spear in hand, by his father's side in the palace at Ithaca. As a separate epic poem, the material of books 1 to 4 is something hard to imagine in the historical context. A Bildungsroman. Indeed, as Knox goes on to note, many of those parts of the Odyssey that can most easily be broken off, reconstructed as once independent lays, do, under a closer analysis, perform important structural or thematic work for the central narrative of Odysseus's homecoming. Emily Wilson agrees. As she puts it, both the Iliad and the Odyssey display striking structural coherence. There is a grand architecture to the storytelling, which might seem to imply the careful planning of a single architect or architects. Is this to say that the various characteristic sections and episodes making up the Odyssey's colourful plot do not have various mythological and narrative origins outside of whatever original legend initially arose around its protagonist? No, certainly that case remains plausible, if not outright certain. But it is to say that the notion of totally fragmented micro-epics circulating independently before a 6th century unification is no longer considered a tenable one. Whatever once separate mythic nuggets were woven together to form the Odyssey we know, whether gradually or all at once, were clearly worked up by the Odyssey poet or poets to such a degree that the use of the term lay, as compared to the short poems of Marie de France, for instance, or the comparatively and then storytelling of other originally piecemeal epics like the Finnish Kalevala, seems a category error. But perhaps a telling one, a reminder of the fact that every reading is itself an expression. Vico posed Homer's true identity as the Greek people in the early 18th century. Wolff developed this idea at the century's close. As Bernard Knox observes, the lays theory grew against the backdrop of a continent-wide interest in folk poetry, an interest so intense it often inspired outright forgery. This was the age of Romanticism. and before long, of nationalism. M. Musical. Among the many characters of Homer's Odyssey are two instrument-playing court poets, Ithaca's Phemius and Phaeacia's Demodocus. We first encounter the former playing for Penelope's suitors in Book 1, and it's through the latter that Book 8 gives us the famous tales of Ares and Aphrodite's affair, and of Odysseus's Trojan horse gambit. Readers trying to glean a better understanding of the poem's elusive legendary composer figure, CH, tend to put Phemius and Demodocus under the microscope, taking these bards as, to some degree, textual reflections of Homer's self. As a result, it has generally been assumed that the Iliad was not only performed, but sung with musical accompaniment on instruments like the pharynx, an early lyre. There have even been some attempts at recreating how these performances may have sounded, with fascinating results. More recently, however, that assumption has been questioned. The earliest figures we know to have practiced the recitation of Homeric poetry were called rhapsodes, active from at least the 6th century BCE, who were generally depicted with a staff with which to beat time, rather than a pharynx or guitarra. Partially on the basis of this mismatch between this image of the classical rhapsode and those instrument-playing singers depicted in Homer's poetry, the standard conclusion was therefore that rhapsodes post-dated these singers, whose musical poetic practice was dominant in the climate of the Odyssey's composition or assembly, and that, again, the Odyssey was initially sung. But to speak of such a mismatch is to assume that Homer's fictional bards are relatively straightforward reflections of the way the Odyssey's composer or composers saw their own craft. And, well, why should that be the case? Richard P. Martin points out the problematic literal-mindedness of this approach, arguing that Homer's depictions of poetic performance are not just attempts at historical realism, but another way for the traditional poet to summon associations and evoke atmosphere. For instance, the musical singing of epic deeds may have been a style already passé in Homer's day, included basically for throwback style points, to better sell the olden days setting for early audiences. Notably, Odysseus' own recounting of his travels, the portion of the poem in which we learn of Circe, the Cyclopes, and so on, is not musical, is unaccompanied. What's more, the poem frames it almost as a song competition with the Phaeacian bard Demodocus, the very practice we know later rhapsodes participated in. We can't be certain either way then, but as with the case of Homer's illiteracy, a historically musical Odyssey is no longer a necessary assumption to make. N. Neoplatonist. The Homeric poems have been pressed into the service of moralistic or ideological arguments for about as long as they've been around. In Book 13 of the Odyssey, our protagonist finally returns to Ithaca. He is received by Athena and led into a nearby sacred cave on the seashore. In Robert Fagel's translation, "Here at the harbour's head the branching olive stands, with the welcome cave nearby it, dank with sea mist, sacred to nymphs of the springs we call the Naiads." There's only one problem with these lines. In reality, Ithaca has no such cave. I mean, there is a cave on Ithaca, traditionally identified with this very passage, but no one that matches Homer's description particularly well. There are two ways to respond to this problem. Option A is to say, problem? What problem? We'd be fools to expect topographical precision in a narrative so expansive. CD. Or hey, maybe the Cave of the Nymphs simply belongs to the magical world of the poem, like Cyclops Land, like Ogygia, and so on, and is invisible to those of us inhabiting the real historical world. Conversely, we have option B. Aha! A minor inconsistency? What did he mean by this? Homer wouldn't lie. It must, therefore, be a hidden symbol for the world's metaphysical truth. In this essay, since Cancer is nearest to us, it is very properly attributed to the moon, which is the nearest of all the heavenly bodies to the earth. The ancients, likewise, very reasonably connected winds with souls proceeding into generation, and again, separating. And I knock on a door and I say, Carol, Carol, I gotta talk to you about Pepe. The growth of the olive in such a situation is not fortuitous, as someone may suspect, but contains the enigma of the Odyssey's brief mention of a strange cave is clearly an elaborate metaphor for how the human soul functions. That's option B, and if you picked B, you might just be a Neoplatonist. Yes, option B included a number of quotations from 3rd century Neoplatonist writer Porphyry's textual commentary on that passage of the Odyssey, in which he very conveniently finds that a 1,000-year-old poem agrees with his school's metaphysical project. If you squint at it and you hit your head with a hammer a few times before you read it. The above spiel isn't the exact way all Neoplatonist thinkers interpreted the Odyssey, it's one particularly overdetermined example, but it is representative in that generally they were more concerned with what light Homer could shed, or rather what light Homer could be made to shed on their ideas about souls and stuff, than they were with the poetry itself. There's nothing uniquely silly about this. You'd be hard-pressed to find a religion or cult that doesn't reinterpret older writing as covert support for their belief system, but it's a bit of a risky game to play, right? Let's even grant that there is some divine, transcendent truth to the universe, and that one group has sussed it out. What are the chances it's the one you happen to be in? What are the chances you're Doug Fawcett? I am willing to go out on a limb and say Porphyry probably wasn't. Maybe the cave's weirdness is deliberate. Maybe it does speak to some hidden meaning, but I don't think it's this one. Oh, original text. This is a misconception still common, and unfortunately one fairly likely to stay that way. Various modern attempts to press the Odyssey into ideological service, see why, might complain about deviations from or attempts to erase the original text. But what original text? The ancient Greek one? Well, which one? The one we actually have, copied into medieval manuscript form thousands of years after its composition? Oh, did I say one? I meant 300, and they're not all the same. No, presumably we're talking about some more ancient original, but do these supposed Homeric original texts contain those episodes, the Iliad's Dolaneia, the Odyssey's Book 24, widely suspected to be later insertions? Well? I'll stop doing the rhetorical question bit. Sheila Murnahan sums up our difficulty. Just as we cannot disentangle the layers of previous history that merged in the written poems of the 8th century, we cannot altogether distinguish the further transformations that those poems underwent before they became the medieval manuscripts on which the texts we currently use are based. Even prior to the ages of manuscript copyists and vernacular translation then, Homer's epics were generally encountered in subtly different forms, and especially so before ancient attempts at standardization in the 3rd century BCE. And we've been over this, CL, but it must be stressed that even the notion of a guy at some point fixing or writing or dictating a complete version of the Odyssey, a Homer with a text, remains conjecture. Even if that were the case, even if there was a blind man from Chios in the 8th century BCE, and you found his tablets or papyri or inscribed animal hides and read the poem back to him, it is doubtful, to say the least, that even he would recognize in his verse an original text. It is difficult to speak of originals when an oral tradition is involved. As Bernard Knox writes, the oral bard who uses formulaic language is not a poet reciting from memory a fixed text. He is improvising along known lines, relying on a huge stock of formulaic phrases, lines, and even whole scenes, but he is improvising. And every time he sings the poem, he may do it differently. The outline remains the same, but the text, the oral text, is flexible. The poem is new every time it is performed. The poem is new every time it is performed. In a sense, it still is with every edition, every diverging manuscript, every translation. It is new again with Chapman and Pope and Lattimore and Fagles and Wilson, and with Jacotet and Schadenwald and Maitsudara for that matter too. What can we say then? Only this. There is always a tradition. There is always a telling, and there are always tellers. P. Pope. Though no longer a household name, the Augustan-era poet Alexander Pope was held in the highest esteem, ranked at the very top of the English canon, during his lifetime and for several decades afterward. One of his crowning achievements was a spellbinding translation of Homer's entire Iliad in heroic couplets, then the height of poetic style, c. And for a short time in the 1720s, many believed he'd translated the whole Odyssey too. But they were wrong. As Samuel Johnson, the dictionary guy, tells it, soon after the appearance of the Iliad, resolving not to let the general kindness cool, he published proposals for a translation of the Odyssey in 5 volumes for 5 guineas. He was willing, however, now to have associates in his labour. In the patent, instead of saying that he had translated the Odyssey, as he had said of the Iliad, he says that he had undertaken a translation, and in the proposals the subscription is said to be not solely for his own use, but for that of 2 of his friends who have assisted him in the work. In truth, only half of the 24 books Pope eventually published had been translated by his own hand. The remaining 12 merely imitated his style, occasional corrections by Pope notwithstanding. And before long, rumours began swirling that Pope's Odyssey wasn't entirely Pope's. In an attempt to get ahead of the controversy, Pope eventually admitted, in very vague terms, to having worked with collaborators, but even so, the details in the confession he gave, says Johnson, are now known not to be true. Why all this misrepresentation, though? Why insist upon the fiction of himself as singular translator? And why do so with a version of the Odyssey, a poem derived from oral tradition, a poem whose very existence is perhaps the best possible argument against such a notion of individual genius? Well, for one, the irony here wouldn't have registered for anyone involved. In Pope's day, Homer was still widely presumed to have been just one real guy, CH. More to the point, though, it seems Pope's main motivation for translating the Odyssey, or rather for publishing a translation of the Odyssey, was the money he could gain selling one in subscription form. Reading demand had exploded in recent years, and individual writers were becoming celebrities, brands, as never before, and none more so than Pope. And what better way is there of speeding up your long-awaited, highly lucrative sequel translation than by only doing half of it yourself? Bitter correspondence survives, showing the gradual realization of Fenton and Broom, Pope's partners come ghostwriters, that Pope was unlikely to share credit. In the end, neither Pope nor his Odyssey suffered lasting reputational damage from his little hoax. Though, as scholar Robin Sowerby writes, most subsequent commentators, perhaps perplexed and embarrassed by the fact of collaboration, have either confined their remarks on Pope's Homer to the Iliad, or have not sought to make any distinctions between the two. A pretty poem, then. But you must not call it Pope. Q. Queen Callidice. What if I told you that after Odysseus spent a decade trying to get home, after a prolonged, devastatingly emotional reunion with his family, he hopped on a boat to the mainland and immediately got nasty with a local queen? You'd probably look at me like I was a big, silly idiot, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but this may have been the story Homer's first audiences were expecting. The peculiar omissions and lacunae in, around, and between Homer's poems, the way, for instance, the judgment of Paris, Helen of Troy's elopement, the eventual sack of Troy itself, and the death of Achilles all happen off-screen, make a lot more sense when you learn the Iliad and Odyssey are, in fact, the only surviving poems from a larger epic cycle, which seems to have told a more complete story of the Trojan War and its heroes. The last poem in the cycle supposedly was called the Telegony, and according to a brief summary of its narrative we do have, the story saw Odysseus travel to Thesprotia, marry a queen called Callidice, father a son, fight off a neighbouring tribe, and only eventually return to Ithaca and Penelope when Callidice dies. After he gets back, though, another son of his, this time by Circe, Telegonus, arrives on Ithaca and accidentally kills his dad. Then he marries his stepmom. On purpose. We can't currently say whether these lost epic cycle poems predate or postdate the Odyssey, but it is likely at least that their general narrative shape existed and was known in Homer's day through older myths. So why are these events ignored by the Odyssey? Well, in Laura Slatkin's words, it is likely that the Odyssey knew these versions of Odysseus' story, but decisively excluded them, as incompatible with a narrative of like-mindedness, mutual desire, and the oikos, or household, restored to order. That is to say, in considering Homer's pointed omission of the Telegony's narrative materials, we might be seeing a case of the Odyssey itself diverging from, rewriting, its source tradition. Queen Callidice, the Thesprotia episode, Telegonus then, these are not dead ideas of the Odyssey, but dead ideas for it. But that isn't to say they're obsolete more widely. Even despite Homer's rejection of this part of Odysseus' story, those few echoes we possess of the lost telegony have rumbled down through the ages. Most recently, we might consider Madeline Miller's wonderful novel Circe, which does succeed in weaving some of the telegony's narrative material into its retelling. Ritualism. The Odyssey is one of the ancient texts cited by James Frazer in his book The Golden Bough, which kicked off the so-called ritualist movement in classical anthropology at the beginning of the 20th century. Snippets of Homer's poem form part of the expansive and unwieldy tapestry of evidence Frazer puts forward to support his central thesis, that much of the world's religion and mythologies trace back more or less directly to a widespread prehistoric sacrifice ritual whereby a magical king-priest would be killed to renew the land. At the time Frazer put forth his theory, it was hotly debated. That is no longer the case. The modern consensus on Frazer's ritualism was perhaps best summed up by René Girard, who called it a grave injustice to ethnology. The Golden Bough did, however, go on to inspire many of the 20th century's foremost creatives and academics. So there's that. Schliemann's Troy. Heinrich Schliemann was a 19th century German businessman who fancied himself something of an archaeologist. In a period where the idea of any historicity underlying the Homeric epics had become doubtful, cf., he became obsessed with proving the existence and location of Troy. He was not alone in this. In 1870, he joined fellow archaeologist Frank Calvert at the Hill of Hisarlik in modern Turkey, a site Calvert had been championing for years, and he started digging. By 1873, the pair had discovered 9 different urban strata within the hill, the oldest of which, we now know, dates back to around 3000 BCE. And finding a hoard of riches concentrated on one particular layer, Schliemann thought he'd found his Troy. Homer's Troy. Schliemann, though, was a maverick, even for the time, and conducted his excavations with dynamite, blasting through all later layers to more easily reach his preferred stratum, now referred to as Troy II, and it is now universally accepted that Schliemann's Troy was several centuries too early to correspond in any way with Homeric Troy. The only real candidates, Troys 6 and 7, were among those later layers Schliemann blasted through to reach Troy II, and suffered substantial damage as a result. You know, because of the Trifunctionalism. In the late 1930s, while researching the social organization of early Germanic societies, French philologist Georges Dumézil got déjà vu. He had seen evidence of strikingly similar practices before, among the Indo-Iranians. Already at this point, it was known that various European gods bore close resemblance to West Asian and Indian gods. Compare Roman sky deity Jupiter to Hindu sky deity Dyaspita, and on the basis of this and similar evidence, the existence of definitely some Proto-Indo-European language, and possibly some kind of unified Proto-Indo-European population, had been established. The result of Dumézil's realization was his so-called trifunctional hypothesis, which ventured that those shared social practices he'd observed signified a fundamental threefold division in that original population, that Proto-Indo-European societies, and possibly daughter societies from India to the Baltic, were split into 3 levels, one focused on sovereignty, one on force, and one on fertility, roughly a caste of priests and kings, a caste of warriors, and a caste of food producers. And because Homer was among the earliest of Greek poets, ca, and because it was by then universally acknowledged that whoever finalized the Homeric poems was working with considerably older narrative stock, cl, Dumézil's supporters were quick to mine the epics for trifunctional residue. A famous Iliadic example is the Judgment of Paris. The set of goddesses Paris of Troy is forced to choose between reproduce this tripartite system. Hera, queen of Olympus, represents sovereignty, warrior goddess Athena stands in for force, and the winner, love goddess Aphrodite, is fertility, for obvious reasons. And the Odyssey too can be read as essentially a catalogue of trifunctional symbolism. Book 12, for instance, has Odysseus face 3 tests, each seeming to correspond to Dumazil's schema. In reverse chronological order, his crew must stay away from sacred cattle, must resist the urge to fight Scylla, and must withstand the womanly allures of the sirens. The famous tale in Book 8 told in the Phaeacian court of Ares and Aphrodite's affair is perhaps scandalous because of the way Ares, a force deity, a second category figure, cavorts with a figure from the third. Or an example of Dumazil's own, the Phaeacians' gifts to Odysseus, riches and clothes signifying opulence and therefore the third category, a sword corresponding to the second, and a cup representing sovereignty and libations to Zeus. All this makes an amount of sense. But, of course, when you're looking through a triangular lens, everything looks like a triangle. C, B, and D, and J. Later in his career, Dumazil, realizing there wasn't nearly enough evidence to support such a bold claim, moved toward a weaker version of his hypothesis, in which the tripartite sovereignty/force/fertility division became conceptually important rather than socially important. That is, trifunctionalism informed the way Indo-Europeans saw the world more than it did the way they structured their social classes. In the years since, Dumazil's methodology has been criticized, and it has been pointed out that the division broadly applies to plenty of non-Indo-European cultures too. We might take the example of Japanese scholar and Dumazil protege Atsuhiko Yoshida. Per Devin Patrick Rain, Yoshida was an admirer of Dumazil's who found striking trifunctional resonances in Japanese mythology. Rather than conclude the non-specificity of his theory, however, he chose instead to hypothesize some degree of indirect influence of Indo-European culture on Japan. Not only this, but trifunctionalism is essentially unfalsifiable. The only thing harder than making plausible sociological assertions about long-extinct cultures is disproving them. The hypothesis still attracts some interest in the field of Indo-European studies, and the study of wider Indo-European links is still an important part of Homeric scholarship, but since the heyday of structuralism in the mid-20th century, interest in trifunctionalism among readers of the Odyssey has largely fallen away. The 2020 Cambridge Guide to Homer's chapter on Indo-European myth omits any mention of it whatsoever. Ulysses. Ulysses is what the Romans called the character we know as Odysseus. This name, as with other Homeric characters' Latin names, is no longer typically used in English translations, CK, and one result of this is that to the modern reader, Ulysses brings not so much to mind Homer's character as it does the slightly warped version of our Ithacon popular in the post-Roman medieval tradition. Because as Jan Parker observes, Odysseus is the most represented, as well as the most variously represented figure of European literature. While it's true that Odysseus's characterization varied slightly in classical Greek literature, the greatest changes were imposed by Roman literary culture, in which the hero became kind of a dick. For an example, see V. The reason for this was a clash of values. The keyword Homer uses to describe Odysseus is polytropos, literally much turning, referring both to the literal way Odysseus's travel saw him turn down many paths, and figuratively to his multifaceted character. To Odysseus the strategist, the man who says one thing and thinks another, as Achilles puts it in Stanley Lombardo's Iliad. And in Roman literary culture, this wiliness took on negative moral overtones. Trickery became inherently dishonorable in a way it hadn't been in Greek myth. This moralizing slant persisted well past the fall of Rome. The intellectual language of Western Europe remained Latin until after the Renaissance, so when the medievals were engaging with Homeric characters, they were doing so via Roman texts and inheriting their biases. Add to this the concept of translatio imperii, that is, the way the powers of medieval Europe attempted to bolster the prestige of their royal dynasties by claiming ultimate descent from Trojan princes, and it's easy to see why the guy who sacked Troy didn't get a great rap in literature of the period. And so Odysseus's, or rather Ulysses' standard role in medieval European romance tales of Troy became that of the traitor. Dante's Inferno, of course, depicts Ulysses burning in the depths of hell. Even as the Greek texts began to re-emerge, c. This medieval vision remained dominant. In Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, the character of Ulysses is, in the words of one critic, a world-class manipulator and debunker of love and honor, who casts a shadow over this sour play. But that was 4 centuries ago, and now, in a world where the Odyssey has regained pride of place, in a world where we're better able to understand that our moral judgments are not necessarily the same as Homer's, the popular image of its hero has shifted back from evil traitor to multifaceted trickster. Now, the medieval Ulysses, Odysseus' dark doppelganger, fades from view. But never entirely. Both because, as with the epic cycle's peculiar Odyssean epilogues, CQ, modern works in the tradition will sometimes attempt to harmonize these two characterizations, and because, as Emily Wilson observes, that scheming medieval Ulysses, even at his most craven, is not entirely alien to the character we meet in Homer. V. Virgil. One of the earliest and most influential versions of this jerk-ass Odysseus haunts the ancient world's other landmark Trojan epic, Virgil's Aeneid. Emily Wilson sums up the Roman poem's complex relationship with the Odyssey. In Virgil's Aeneid, Odysseus becomes cruel Odysseus, the unscrupulous destroyer of Troy, which was the home of the poem's hero. But Aeneas himself becomes a new kind of Odysseus in his search for a home that exists only in the future, the city of Rome itself. In one way, Virgil's fraught reception of the Odyssey's protagonist, split between reproach and mimicry, is a microcosm of his Aeneid's larger project. Since ancient times, it has been recognized that Virgil's epic was an attempt to imitate and rival Homer. This aim is visible everywhere in the poem. The Aeneid is a poem of 2 halves. The first 6 books see hero Aeneas flee Troy, sail the Mediterranean, carefully avoid the island of Circe, and visit the underworld, a faux Odyssey, and the last 6 detail the war between the Trojans and the Latins, and the eventual defeat of the foe's near-invincible hero leader Turnus, a faux Iliad, this one won by the Trojans, the Romans' legendary ancestors. We see Virgil attempt to outdo Homer in the poem's very first words, arma virumque cano, literally arms and the man I sing of. There are even a few unintentionally amusing, fanficky attempts at scoring points against the Homeric Odysseus. In Book 3, Virgil has Aeneas arrive on Polyphemus' island right after Odysseus sails off and rescue a sailor the dastardly Greek had abandoned. Why the stylus measuring contest? Well, the Homeric poems have been pressed into the service of moralistic or ideological arguments for about as long as they've been around, and the case of the Aeneid is no different. Virgil's major motivation for writing it was propagandistic. One of the poem's central through lines, perhaps the through line, is the way the story serves to glorify the rule of Augustus, Rome's first true emperor, and, if you believed his family's claims, the distant descendant of Aeneas himself. We should not rush to cancel him for his poem's imperialist sympathies. Virgil had lived through a bloody disintegration of Italian society, and whatever else the de facto end of Rome's partial democracy meant to him, a big part of Virgil's imperialist sympathy surely came from the fact that everyone had finally stopped killing each other under Augustus. That such motives allowed the poet to produce something as rich and enduring as the Aeneid speaks to the depth of Virgil's creativity, feeling, and skill. But there is a strong sense in which the Aeneid, or at least the Aeneid today, succeeds in spite of this politicizing drive, not because of it. As Aeneid translator C. Day Lewis writes, the frequent place names and family names, some of the customs and legends even, which Virgil introduced to glorify the Roman people and its history, can be of interest only to scholars nowadays. And indeed, as many have observed, those moments in which Virgil consciously complicates the imperial propaganda are among the poem's richest. Even despite those more overtly propagandistic passages having somewhat calcified for the modern reader, the Aeneid is by no means obsolete, is by no means a dead text, whatever that phrase even means. In Jasper Griffin's words, Virgil's poem remains a profound and moving meditation on the nature and nemesis of power. But if Virgil did ever hope that the poem would out-Odyssey the Odyssey, would supersede Homer, would proclaim the superiority of Rome over Greece as Rome's generals had done a century earlier, we can say that, as it stands today, this hope was in vain. When we think of a wayward, seafaring, princess-abandoning hero fleeing Troy, it is still Odysseus that comes to mind. W. Womanly. There are a lot of ways in which the Odyssey is kind of the yang to the Iliad's yin, expansive where its predecessor is constrained, a comedy of sorts to the Iliad's tragedy, a world of peace instead of a world at war. And, as has often been observed, female instead of male. The Odyssey is an epic with a thoroughly domestic base, Bernard Knox writes, and almost everywhere in this peaceful world, women have important roles. We should be careful not to overstate this point. Both of the Odyssey's protagonists are male, of course, but comparing the poem to its predecessor, it's impossible to miss that significantly more women play significantly bigger roles. Indeed, the Odyssey's female characters do tend to be the more interesting ones. Athena, Circe, Calypso, Nausicaa, Penelope, and so on possess, in the words of one commentator, a mysteriousness which the male characters fail to master. The Odyssey's poet has a sympathetic understanding of the human heart, Bernard Knox continues, especially the female. So, of course, English novelist Samuel Butler's reasoning went in an 1897 book, it must have been written by a woman. Specifically a young woman, in contrast to the aged man Butler presumes wrote the Iliad, because the Iliad is better. And a young woman on Sicily, the real Ithaca, because the Sicilian coast better matches the poem's description than the waters around Ithaca. At one point, Butler even ventures that the character of Nausicaa is an author self-insert. The Sicilian argument is, of course, misguided. Again, see D. Aside from this, though, it might seem worth considering. At present, we have no evidence of women in epic tradition as composers or rhapsodes, but that isn't necessarily to say none will be found. After all, we have in Sappho an example of a prolific female poet only 2 centuries later. But even putting to one side the very problematic assumptions Butler's authoress theory strides past, granting that there is a solitary author of the Odyssey is probably a bigger leap than assuming any gender would be, ch. Questions of evidence and comparison have less to do with the mainstream rejection of Butler's theory than does the basic sexist flaw in that theory's logic. In claiming that only a female writer could have been this attentive to femininity and gender dynamics, Butler was, of course, articulating the limitations of his own period far more than those of archaic Greece. X. Xenophanes. The Homeric poems have been pressed into the service of moralistic or ideological arguments for about as long as they've been around. One early example, surviving only in fragment, is the complaint of Xenophanes of Colophon, who condemned Homer for attributing to the gods the sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among men, including theft and adultery, and suggested censorship in response. We have enough of Xenophanes' writing to conclude this invective formed part of a larger, then pioneering, theological project of divine perfection. But this call for censorship, later echoed by Plato, was not heeded. Roman historian Suetonius reports that centuries later the despotic emperor Caligula considered banning the Odyssey, but similarly, if that ban was ever enacted, it was either temporary, ineffective, or both. Why? YouTube. One of the reasons we typically consider the Odyssey to have been written more recently than the Iliad comes in the difference between the poem's depictions of the Phoenicians, a mercantile people originating around modern Lebanon, the people, in fact, whose letters were the basis of the Greek alphabet, ca. The narrator of the Iliad seems to express a respect for Phoenician craftsmanship, but in the Odyssey they tend to be represented as scoundrels, swindlers. The historical picture we have of Greek-Phoenician relations is one of initial friendliness gradually turning to competition and conflict. So, the argument goes, this striking difference in Homeric depiction makes the most sense if the poems were spaced out by a generation or two, a space of time that may have seen Greek opinion of their southeastern neighbors sour markedly enough to be reflected in their poetic culture. That may be the reason. It may not be the reason. Frankly, I'm less interested in the reason behind it than I am in the shift itself. Between the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Phoenicians go from making masterpieces. From them, the Iliad poet tells us, Achilles acquired the most beautiful mixing bowl on earth, to being sea dogs, unscrupulous peddlers, hawking nothing more than flashy baubles. Maybe there wasn't a change. Maybe Achilles just didn't realize he'd been ripped off. The Homeric poems have been pressed into the service of moralistic or ideological arguments for about as long as they've been around, and today there's maybe no greater point of sale for such arguments than here, YouTube. Maybe you've heard about this, but there's a film adaptation coming out soon. Or I should say another film adaptation coming out soon. This one's written and directed by Christopher Nolan, and I have it on good authority that means billions must die. I say good authority, I mean YouTube told me this. Countless videos in the last months alone tell us that a movie adaptation nobody has seen is woke. It tells us so to the tune of millions upon millions of views. I didn't even go looking for them. Google recommended one of Holocaust denier John De La Rosa's videos railing about woke translations near the very top of the page after I'd searched for some wholly unrelated information in the process of writing this video. I watched the start of it. It's a list of versions to read that are supposedly more accurate to Homer than Emily Wilson's Odyssey. The first two recommendations are a kid's collection of Greek myths and Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. As always, the specifics differ from video to video. Nerdrotic claims that this is Nolan entering the culture war, and Endymion TV has a loose series of videos framing the right-wing backlash against the film in civilizational terms. It's a Western classic, a European story that Hollywood is undermining. Never mind the fact that these are categories that would have been meaningless to Homer. If the Odyssey's composers or early audiences understood Europe as a geographical term at all, they would only have referred to a section of mainland Greece. Or, speaking of threats to Western civilization, former Russian asset Benny Johnson released an incredibly racist video about Lupita Nyong'o's casting about a month ago that, among other things, argues that since Helen of Troy isn't an Ethiopian, that means she's white. Those are the two types of people. He then complains that the wokies aren't reading the original story, the one that, quote, launched all epics, because he doesn't know it's a sequel, while he searches for textual details through Google's AI overview. Recommended near this was a video by Black Pigeon Speaks. Helen shouldn't have been race-swapped to black, the thumbnail seems to argue. She should have been race-swapped to Northern European. It ought to go without saying, but if the film was attempting to reach some sense of historical realism for the Odyssey's semi-fantastical context, cf, through casting, a red-haired or even an Anglo-Saxon actress for Helen would have been just as inaccurate a stand-in for a Bronze Age woman from the Eastern Mediterranean as an actor of Kenyan ancestry. And you know what? That would have been fine too, because this is not what Nolan's film is attempting. Homer's Odyssey is a product of ancient Greece. 2026's The Odyssey is a British-American product of the 21st century. It's worth drawing this point out a little further. To touch on another of Nolan's controversial picks, there is something notable about Elliot Page's casting, but it's not that he's too wimpy or, insert other transphobic dog whistle adjective here to play a warrior, that's what they've all been saying. It's that he's playing Sinon. Sinon is not in Homer's Odyssey, or his Iliad for that matter. He's a mythologically related figure, sure, and he's in the Aeneid, but this character's presence is, for anyone with a clue about the source tradition, a big glowing sign that Nolan is not trying to produce some straight translation of Homer's poem onto the screen. And we should all be glad, because that would have been impossible. No film can ever really be the Odyssey, because films aren't poems. How do you film a Homeric simile, for one? And even if films could be poems, a film could still never be the Odyssey, because there already is something that's the Odyssey. You might have heard of it. It's called the Odyssey. Various factors have overlapped to produce and maintain this moment of discourse. Some go back millennia, like the lingering prestige of Homer and the Troy topos, responsible for the Odyssey's central place in the European literary canon. Some go back only a decade or so, the Gamergate of it all. There's the addictive denialist function Naomi Klein observes in the conspiracies like DEI and Great Replacement Theory that provide the Odyssey backlash's rhetorical skeleton. The way the building of narratives like these, however implausible, allow their adherents to avoid confronting the real horrors of the modern world. There is perhaps the particular shape of modern consumer capitalism. As philosopher Byung-Chul Han writes, the emotional design of our social media platforms molds emotions and shapes emotional patterns for the sake of maximizing consumption. And behind that, certainly there is the profit motive, responsible for both the retention-based architecture beneath that emotional design, the structure behind a million radicalizing content feedback loops, and of course YouTube's unwillingness to enforce its terms of service when that radicalizing content brings in enough traffic. The line between artisan and swindler can be blurry. It's not always easy to tell if you've got a hold of some real good solid work or if you're being sold a cheap bauble in disguise. But I hope this video provides one way of doing this when it comes to working through arguments around a text like the Odyssey. Are you being told that the text, its tradition, its culture, is at stake in any lasting way? If so, buyer beware. The Odyssey is not in danger. Not that it's trying to, of course, but Christopher Nolan's film will not replace or rewrite Homer for good or ill. It can't. No film can do this. No thing can do this. You could no more destroy the Odyssey than you could keep its hero away from his Nostos, than you could chart his journey on our maps, than you could stop rosy-fingered dawn from bringing light to mortal men. I'm not going to lie to you and say new ideas, new adaptations even, never affect the present state, the future of a tradition. They do, of course they do. They can change the way we talk about, or imagine, or retell the text moving forward. But, as we've seen, on a long enough time frame, relatively few of them stick. So if this film has something exciting or fresh or relevant to say about the Odyssey, or through the Odyssey even, if it is productive of further meaning, then it'll stick around. Maybe. Perhaps even for a century or two. But then, if not well before, it will diminish, like Chapman's Homer, like the medieval Ulysses. Nolan's Odysseus will follow the Neoplatonist Odysseus, the bicameral Odysseus, and march off into some twilight, to Thesprotia, to a gentle death far from the sea. The Homeric poems have been pressed into the service of moralistic or ideological arguments for about as long as they've been around. And if there is one thing we can observe in this repeating pattern, it is this. The poems tend to last, and those arguments tend not to. At time of recording, and hopefully at time of release, it is too early to say how accurate, how viable the image this slice of YouTube has sold of The Odyssey, the film, is. I expect it will bear very little resemblance, but the movie isn't out yet, so I can't tell you what it is or isn't. What I can tell you, however, is that the fragile, embattled, narrow picture these voices have painted of the Odyssey, this immortal poem, and its still vibrant, multifaceted yet much enduring tradition, was stone dead from the beginning. Z. Zeus's Mercy. One of Zeus's roles, one of his most important roles, is the protector of strangers. Throughout the Odyssey, we hear characters associate him again and again with good hospitality, call him Zeus Xenios. When Odysseus pleads for mercy with the Cyclops Polyphemus, he claims Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and supplicants. Is Odysseus right? Should we see the gods of the Odyssey as fair? As representing a tentative first step toward ancient belief in a more ordered divinity? It's an age-old question. Some modern critics have spoken of an ethical transformation in the gods between the Iliad and the Odyssey. But this line of thinking was perhaps taken to its farthest extreme in late antiquity, with an editorial quibble over one phrase. Book 13, line 158. In Robert Fagel's translation, this line reads, "Then pile your huge mountain round about their port." The context is this. Odysseus has just been sent on a ship to Ithaca by the Phaeacians, but this angered the god Poseidon, who'd been trying to obstruct Odysseus's homecoming. The islanders didn't know they were going against the sea god's wishes, and indeed had behaved as perfect hosts to their wayward guest, fulfilling utterly the program of hospitality set out by Zeus Xenios. Poseidon complains to Zeus and asks for permission to exert revenge on the Phaeacians and effectively destroy their civilization by piling a huge mountain around their port, and the line is Zeus's reply. Zeus says yes, or at least he does in the version that made it into manuscript form. Aristophanes of Byzantium, one of the ancient editors who attempted to fix the Homeric texts into one stable form, put forward a different rendering of line 158. As Bernard Knox puts it, by changing 3 letters in the Greek, he made Zeus end his speech with the words, "But do not pile a mountain round the city. The Phaeacians will not be cut off from the sea." In this version, Zeus Xenios lives up to his title. He is a Zeus who has undergone an ethical transformation. But Knox counters, there is no warrant for this alteration. Indeed, he argues, from the perspective of textual consistency, it creates far more problems than it solves. Even in antiquity, this seems to have been recognized. We know that after Aristophanes proposed his version, its legitimacy was challenged by his pupil Aristarchus, who went on to argue at length against this alteration to the fate of the Phaeacians, and against, it seems, the manufacture of a truly merciful Zeus. In Aristarchus's preferred version, the version that ultimately survived, the reader must conclude that divine pride comes before all else. That in this instance, the revenging of an insult paid to the gods, even accidentally, trumped any of their ethical obligations. 2 millennia and change later, opinions still differ, but Aristophanes' softer version is generally regarded as spurious. Ultimately then, the gods of the Odyssey are still the gods of the Iliad. In the words of Emily Wilson, self-interested beings whose interventions in human lives are motivated primarily by their own desires, whims, and preferences, rather than by a consistent commitment to uphold moral law. We should sympathize with the Xenophanes and Aristophaneses of the world to a point. We should be mindful about the ways we read and retell a text like the Odyssey. Homer's epics glorify the aristocracy, they see nothing wrong with slavery as an institution, and so on. And derivative works do arguably have a responsibility to wrestle with aspects like these. We should continue to bring our own concerns to bear on our engagement with Homeric epic, but we should not expect the text or the tradition to conform to them. Before we finish, I hope you'll permit me to quote Wilson again at length, this time a wonderful passage from the end of her Odyssey's translation note. "There is a stranger outside your house. He is old, ragged, and dirty. He is tired. He has been wandering homeless for a long time, perhaps many years. Invite him inside. You do not know his name. He may be a thief. He may be a murderer. He may be a god. He may remind you of your husband, your father, or yourself. Do not ask questions. Wait. Let him sit on a comfortable chair and warm himself beside your fire. Bring him some food, the best you have, and a cup of wine. Let him eat and drink until he is satisfied. Be patient. When he is finished, he will tell you his story. Listen carefully. It may not be as you expect."
Thank you for watching. In the old days, a well-told tale, a well-stitched song would sometimes occasion rewards. YouTube doesn't much go in for that line of thinking these days, but if you liked this video and you want to see more like it in the future, perhaps you'd consider taking a look at one of my Patreon tiers. I'm very grateful for the support of everyone who pledges already, especially Birding Baddie, Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Deathstroke HQ, Harry Price, Kwang Yu Liu, Nothing, Something Something Capitalism Bad, Stephen Van Doren, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy, and I'll see you all next time.